This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello. This is Simon Brew, and I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine. And
this is Media Break.
No, it's not.
You give us 3 minutes.
What?
And we'll give you the world.
Tell you what, you give me an hour, I'll give you a podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
But the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is completely given away in its title. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the behind-the-scenes stuff, those bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. I just think it's a job and a half to get a film made, and I kind of want to celebrate that, really. Now, the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories, well, they both had a bit of a mixed reception. Both have got stories behind them as well. So I'm going to crack on and tell you the first of those. I'm going to play you a clip. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
I've been very patient, Johnson. 5 months. Who's that?
Fax, Dr. Juliet Fax, just been moved up to head the attitude adjustment team.
5 months. $90 million. I want to see some results.
Yes, sir. I'll show you what we have.
OCP pioneered cyborg technology, and now we take a quantum leap forward. State-of-the-art destructive capabilities commanded by a unique combination of software and organic systems. In every way, an improvement over the original. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you RoboCop 2.
You are under arrest.
Crikey, guess what that's a clip from? That's right, it's 1990's RoboCop 2, directed by Irving Kershner. It would be his last film. Screenplay credited to Frank Miller and Wallon Green. It's based on a story by Frank Miller. Starring Peter Weller, Nancy Allen, Daniel O'Hurley, Tom Noonan, Belinda Bayer and Gabriel Damon. That's the lead cast for this particular film. And the story of RoboCop 2 started, days really, after the release of RoboCop 1. Because the original RoboCop film, which came out in 1987, was the definition, really, of a sleeper hit. That Orion Pictures was the studio behind it. Paul Verhoeven directed the film, and it went on to gross, over $50 million, and nobody really saw that coming. Nobody saw back in 1987 either, even in the aftermath of the film's release, that it would go on to be regarded as the sci-fi classic it's regarded as today. But it's also one of those sci-fi classics that's had lots of sequels that haven't quite captured what the original did. Nonetheless, back in 1987, Orion Pictures, which, it had always lived a little bit hand to mouth, but it was shortly to invest in a pair of Oscar winners, Dances with Wolves, The Silence of the Lambs. It had backed Best Picture winners, Platoon and Amadeus, and it had confidence, and all of a sudden it had a blockbuster hit on its hands. So it wanted a sequel, and it wanted a sequel fast. Now, what Orion didn't know at this stage was real turmoil for the company was ahead, courtesy of its 1989 slate of movies, a slate of films that basically put the perilous existence of the company heavily under threat. I'm thinking films like Great Balls of Fire and She-Devil, in which it had invested sizable amounts of money and didn't get much return at all. But still, by that stage, it had the sequel to RoboCop in its sights. But crikey, would it need it? So, producer John Davison was asked by Orion fairly quickly to develop a sequel to RoboCop. Now, Davison would admit he wasn't a fan of sequels, but he was faced with an interesting choice here of one of two projects to produce. Now, he'd been asked by Warren Beatty to produce Dick Tracy, which was being prepared for a 1990 release, and he was asked by Orion to produce RoboCop 2. Now, Orion wanted RoboCop 2 quicker than 1990, but that's ultimately when it would come out. So in the end, he opted for the former for two reasons. Number one, he felt that Dick Tracy was really Warren Beatty's project, and Beatty's notoriously controlling of his films and very precise of them. And secondly, well, RoboCop was his hit, wasn't it? And so even though he didn't particularly like the idea of doing sequels, I think it's one of those where the idea of someone else doing it was even worse. But one person who definitely wasn't going to return was Paul Verhoeven as director. Because by this stage, Carol Coe had written him a check to bring the film Total Recall to the screen, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. That would also land in 1990 as well. And so, first and foremost, Davison needed a director. And for a while, it looked like he needed a new RoboCop as well, because Peter Weller would admit to Starlog magazine, its August 1990 issue that I've got in front of me here, he just was straight up. He said, I had reservations about doing RoboCop 2, and we're going to come to those. But first and foremost, the incumbent writers were Michael Miner and Edward Neumeier, and they penned the first film, and so they got cracking on a second one. And in September 1987, they were giving a deadline of the end of that year to come up with a script. Now, they wrote this not knowing who was going to direct. They wrote this without the certainty that Weller was going to be starring in it. And what they came up with is a pretty well-known unmade script called RoboCop 2: The Corporate Wars. That's ultimately how it came to be known. And they decided to set their RoboCop story some 25 years down the line from the original film. And the idea here would be that the US had changed into, instead of having the familiar cities that we know of now, it would have changed into a series of what were called plexes born out of old cities. If you thought the original RoboCop took influence from 2000 AD and Judge Dredd comic strips, as some had suggested, there was, yes, I think there was more of a passing hint of it as well with the idea for the corporate wars. This 25 years later story would have put the sinister corporate behemoth Omni Consumer Products, OCP, out of business, and instead there's an evil company in its place called Flickr. Now, in case lawyers are listening who represent a very popular picture sharing website on the internet, I might point out that the evil corporate firm of RoboCop 2, the Corporate Wars, was Flickr that had an E in it, and never have I been so grateful that Flickr can't spell its own name. So this would basically settle down to a story about trying to kill off and clear away the poor to make room for the rich, and this was the idea that they were pursuing. Now, one of the people who wasn't keen on it was Peter Weller. He suggested that he was very complimentary about Miner and Neumeier, but he did suggest that this one hadn't really captured what was right about the first film. But also Orion wasn't too keen on good chunks of this and the direction in which it was going. And it ultimately got to a point where it wanted change of writers, and it found the cover it needed to fire Miner and Neumeier from the project. Because in early 1988, the Writers Guild of America went on strike, and because of that, Orion suggested that Miner and Neumeier had breached their contract to write the film by going on strike, and thus they were fired. New writers were therefore required, and two names from the world of comic books came to the fore. One was Alan Moore and the other was Frank Miller. Now, somewhat inevitably, if you're familiar with Alan Moore's opinions towards film adaptations of his work, things like V for Vendetta, for instance, Moore turned it down. He just wasn't interested. But Frank Miller was, and he worked on several drafts of a RoboCop 2 script, and with writing underway on the film to a point that Orion was at least vaguely comfortable with, other parts of the project could start moving forward. Now, in theory, it's worth noting that Miller's script was going to be started from scratch. There's some suggestion that there is overlap with the corporate wars idea that had been developed by Miner and Neumeier. And in fact, even though Miller's ultimate ideas would be changed quite a lot to the point where he would that they would be published separately. I'll come to that at the end of this. But with more working on the script, Davison was now at a point of looking at a new director to take over from Paul Verhoeven. So Repo Man director Alex Cox, he was offered the chance and he dallied with the idea of it for a few days, but it was never close to getting any kind of commitment off him, and he fairly quickly turned the project down. Now, a film that bubbled up around this time was one called River's Edge, and the director of that film was Tim Hunter, and Davison recruited him to helm RoboCop 2. And it was with Tim Hunter as director that Davison could also approach Peter Weller about basically trying to get him to sign on the dotted line to play RoboCop. And of course, Alex Murphy, the dual roles again. Now, Weller hadn't been keen on the original script for it, but there were certain things that, I mean, he was tempted in the end to return. Because, I mean, he had concerns about how uncomfortable the first film was. And going back to that Starlog interview I was talking about before, he asked the question, do I want to go through what it takes to develop, express and delineate a character inside of a suit? All the training it takes, all the preparation, and on for months. And he wasn't, I mean, he was genuinely reluctant to come back for the film, but he ultimately admitted, I didn't feel quite complete with the character. I knew there was something else to say with it. Now, one of the things that helped lure him back was bringing in Moni Yakim, who taught him his robotic movements for the first film, and just the small team around him. It sounds like Weller was really quite loyal to them and keen for them to return, and it just made it an environment where it was easier for him ultimately to say yes. But by this stage, Frank Miller's ideas for the screenplay, they were causing a little bit of concern as well. Now, in his script, he'd brought OCP back, as we would get in the final film, and it was back to corporate politics and not very good behaviour from big companies. There was more of Alex Murphy and his wife's backstory in the film. There's more of the character of Ann Miller in the movie as well, as played by Nancy Allen. But Orion looked at the script that Miller had put together and just bluntly, and again, this is a pretty well-known story, didn't think it could be filmed. I mean, it's pretty much a straight down the line criticism of it, that they couldn't make the film that Miller had scripted. And so by this stage, with Weller signing on the dotted line, there was the bringing in of another writer just to try and wrestle this script into something that works. So in came Wallon Green, who a legendary Hollywood screenwriter to a point, because he'd written things like The Wild Bunch, and he was brought in to work with Miller's material and try and get it towards some kind of shooting script. But also by this stage, the film, as it was heading towards production, had lost its director, that it was felt that Hunter wasn't the right man to direct the kind of sly subversive humour that Miller was aiming for in his screenplay. Now, producer John Davison did a really good and interesting interview with the website Robo Archive, which I hugely recommend. And he talked about what led to Tim Hunter departing the project. He said, I think what scared Tim off was the fact that the picture had to start shooting because of our locked-in release date. Orion wanted this now for the summer of 1990, and yet the story hadn't completely been licked yet. This release date was staring us in the face, and Tim was worried that there just wasn't enough time to get the script the way he wanted it. And so what John Davison needed was really a director for hire, an experienced pair of hands who could come in and shepherd the film to the screen. Now, it was unlikely he was going to get as individual a director as a Paul Verhoeven, but nonetheless, was there someone who could get them to hit all these deadlines with shooting, depending which story you believe, either a month or a week away at this point without a director on board? And so Davison got in touch with Irving Kershner. Now, Kershner's most prominent film was The Empire Strikes Back, and that was clearly an appeal to Davison, that he'd come into someone else's franchise and directed the second film and turned it into what's widely regarded as the best Star Wars movie. Peter Weller met with Kershner. He was happy, and with the team around Weller also on board, Irving Kershner was reportedly given a script on a Friday, and he needed to sign up by the Monday, really, to get the film going, that shooting was going to begin, or at the very least heavy production work was going to begin, within days of him saying yes. Now, it's worth noting, in the midst of Peter Weller going backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards over Peter Weller's return to the title role, that Orion Pictures was actually a bit more laissez-faire about whether he needed to come back. That it figured that, oh, it's a man in a suit and hidden behind a tin can for most of the film. So it didn't really need to play hardball with him. But nonetheless, it was happy that Weller signed back up. And also a lot of the original RoboCop team did as well. Rob Bottin came back to make the bodysuit. Phil Tippett was, the legendary Phil Tippett was back on stop motion duties. And also there were familiar faces from the cast returning from the first film as well as Tom Noonan cast as the new villain, Kane. Now, I found while researching this an article that the late Irving Kershner wrote for the Los Angeles Times around the time of the movie's release, and he talked about his reasons for taking the film on, and he admitted straight up at this point that when I agreed to make RoboCop 2, I had misgivings. RoboCop was entertaining and stylish, but depended on violence and shock effects. I knew that if I made RoboCop 2, the film would have to satisfy the anticipation of the audience. And so he decided on his approach. He said, I decided to use a comic strip style to tell a serio-comic fairy tale that would reflect a cautionary note for today. Now, that was all easier said than done, really, because even though Kershner wasn't supposed to tinker with the screenplay for RoboCop 2, he felt he had no choice, that the script really wasn't there at the point that shooting was beginning. And so his work on the script would continue, along with Frank Miller, right the way through production. And Kershner said, we tried to create situations and characters that would show social breakdown, drugs, the city gone bad, big business jumping into a social vacuum, easy to satisfy its greed and lust for power. But he had to make these changes while the film was shooting. He didn't have prep time. He didn't have a chance even to take a week or two with the script and come up with some alterations. This was a very big production that was on the tracks and moving. And it's worth noting that it really did scale up as well, that whilst RoboCop was pretty much an off-radar film, the level of expectation building up around RoboCop 2, well, that was far more substantive. I should note too that even though Kershner didn't have much in the way of prep time, that it had been known for a couple of years this film was happening, and so the production team, well, they'd been building up to sequences even though they hadn't been fully written, and also work was done to make the actual physical RoboCop suit a lot more comfortable for Peter Weller to wear. That he was going through the routine of doing the physical training he needed to get in shape for the film. I mean, he gave that Starlog interview, he talks about doing 18 to 20 hour days on the movie, although his quote doesn't make it clear whether that was the working days when he was training and doing other projects or actually the shoot of the film. The suit itself was still £35 to wear, but it was made of fiberglass this time. It was more flexible. It had a slightly different colour scheme to it as well, but that was deliberate. That was kind of the effect they were going for with the first film, and they had a bit more time to get it right in the second. I'd suggest it doesn't quite look right in the second, ironically, but there we go. And Weller carried on just playing the role, pitching it the only way he could, really, as treating it as a guy who has amnesia, and to play it that way. Now, as they headed towards the autumn-winter production start in 1989, there was one logistical hurdle that also had to be navigated, and that was a change in location for the film. That the original movie was shot in Dallas, but this time around, Davison, I mean, going back to that interview with RoboArchive, he talks about that they couldn't get really the cooperation they needed from the Dallas authorities, that they wanted to shoot action sequences on the street, and it was really hard to get the permissions. And even though the first film had been a success, well, this time it was just going to be much trickier, and as such they decided to change location. They moved to Houston, where they were much more warmly welcomed. In fact, you can find newspaper archive articles online about just how welcoming Houston made the RoboCop 2 production. So October 1989 then, and this was 9 months before the film was heading into cinemas, a little less than that. Kershner was in the director's chair. The visual effects had been prepared even without a finished script. In fact, Tim Hunter, when he was director, had overseen a lot of the design work. And let's go back to Starlog, where Weller talks about the shooting of the film. I mean, he talks about the suit. He said this time it's a little more civilized. And he talks about the shoot of the movie, saying we were on a high wire the whole time with the first movie. We're comparing the manic style of Paul Verhoeven directing to the calmer style of Irving Kershner. Weller described the original RoboCop and the making of it as, quote, madness every day. But on the second, he said Kirsch, short for Irving Kershner, of course, is a much more even kind of guy. Weller described him as he's a journeyman director, as if that was a compliment. But he said more attention to detail, which, given the larger canvas and the bigger budget of the sequel, seemed to be pretty much appreciated, although there are contrasting opinions on that coming shortly. There were contrasting opinions too on the state of the film's ending as production was ongoing, that there was concern. Miller, Kershner and Weller, it was said, weren't happy with the finale really just being a crash bang action blast 'em up, and they wanted it to have a bit more of a human angle to it, although that was a fight I don't think they ultimately won in the end. And it was only over time really that the stories of this not being a happy shoot started to filter out, and Nancy Allen over time has given a couple of interviews where she suggested that, suggested is one way of putting it, firmly putting it strongly is the other, because whilst she was towing the party line at the point of the film's release, she talked about, say for instance, she gave an interview to Sci-Fi Wire where she said, we had some great fight scenes choreographed for RoboCop 2, but Kershner was such a miserable human being, he didn't want to bother with most of it. In fact, she did a convention, I think it was in 2010 basically, where she talked about how she just didn't like him, didn't like working with him. There was an article too that came out around the time of the film's release that talked about it being an unhappy set, that people were not particularly happy with Kershner. But then one of those who defended him was Peter Weller, who said that he just had a decent time working on the film with him, that it was a difficult film, that the film was the film script was in continual flux. Orion, this was very much on the company's radar now and was very hands-on. It got to the point where new lines were coming to the actors very, very late in the day. I mean, on the day of filming, in some cases, go one or two of the stories. And in the background of this, Orion's financial problems were bubbling up, that the stories in the trades were this was the film that Orion really needs to be a massive hit to pretty much stay in business. So no pressure on this. There's a great big huge looming deadline. The very future of the company that's making it could potentially be on the line. That the scale of it is much bigger than first time round, and what could possibly go wrong, because this was a really hard film to make. I mean, to give an idea of the scale of it, it was said that 8 different teams were working with the miniature effects on the movie. We were still a year away from Terminator 2, 3 years away from Jurassic Park, so it wasn't even conceived that computers would do much of the heavy lifting, and thus the effects work that you see in the film was practical and better for it, I'd suggest, but it involved an awful lot of miniature expertise from Phil Tippett and his team. Now, filming on RoboCop 2 wrapped up in early January 1990, and it was apparently slightly ahead of schedule as well, but the stories about Orion were really coming more and more to the fore at this point, that it invested $30-odd million in this particular movie, and if we compare that with the original RoboCop, that had been, about 10-15 million to make, but the original RoboCop had taken 53 million at the US box office, and the hope was RoboCop 2 could do an awful lot more than that. Now, at this stage as well, we were in the point where Orion was considering selling some of its films. It would ultimately sell The Addams Family that it had made, and midway through the shoot of The Addams Family, it sold it to Paramount Pictures. But into post-production, RoboCop 2 went, and it was eyeing its release in June of 1990. The ancillaries, the merchandising and bits and bobs around it, well, that was coming into play as well, that there was going to be a computer game again. Computer game in the first two, 3 RoboCop films are terrific. But in the editing suite, there were problems with lots of deleted scenes that were being excised from the movie. And in particular, due to the almost inevitable battle with the Motion Picture Association of America, the American Ratings Board, the MPAA. Because, I mean, the MPAA had not particularly got along with the original RoboCop to the point where several cuts had to be made so it could get an R rating, and the alternative of that is a rating that American cinemas just wouldn't show the film. And so at this stage it was the X rating that they were all trying to avoid, and several cuts were made to RoboCop 2 to try the violence in particular being cut back to make sure that it got a rating that would allow mainstream multiplex cinemas to show the film. Now, I'm told, although I've not seen it, but I think the Internet Archive has a work print of RoboCop 2 that leaked online that includes some of the many extra scenes that were not in the final cut of the film, that the running time, I mean, tellingly, the running time of the sequel is 117 minutes against the hour and a half lean running time of the first movie, but even then bits and bobs were cut out. Now, going back to that Irving Kershner article that he wrote for the Los Angeles Times, and again, this came out like a couple of weeks after the movie's release, and he said, I wanted RoboCop 2 to create an allegorical vision of tomorrow, playing within the rules of an entertaining action film that would be exciting, colourful and comedic with contemporary relevance. And he signed off the article with, according to the critics, I failed. Well, yes, I mean, there's no way around that. I mean, critics were hardly bowled over in some cases by the original RoboCop, but its reputation had grown and grown heavily. RoboCop 2, well, it was just a bit more mixed. That there were positive notices for the film, but it was noted that really the intelligence of the first movie and the satire had just been dialed down so much, and in its place was just a big summer blast 'em up, and a vaguely entertaining big summer blast 'em up. To be fair, I don't think RoboCop 2 is a terrible film. I just think it follows RoboCop, and as a result of that, there is what are you supposed to do? Nonetheless, it would be wrong to call this one a box office failure. It's just, it was saddled with such high expectations from its parent company. It opened on June the 22nd in 1990 at the American box office, and that weekend it was in second place behind, ironically, Dick Tracy, which was then in its second week of release, and it was one place above ahead of, wouldn't you know it, Total Recall, which had been around for a month. Still, that opening weekend of 14 million wasn't bad, but could it hold on to that? And could it possibly even get close to 100 million? Well, spoiler, no, it couldn't, because the audience fell away by 55% in the second week, and it was fairly clear fairly quickly to Orion that this was not the White Knight that it really, really, really needed. In fact, in the US, RoboCop 2 would gross $45 million in the end, less than the first movie, and it had cost an awful lot more to make because they'd spent an awful lot more marketing this one and pushing it and really getting word of the film out, and yet the response was lower than the first movie. In fact, there's a little dig as well that is worth digging out, to just go into some of the unhappiness from the effects team are working with Orion, because there's a moment in the film, going very spoiler light, where RoboCop gets a whole new list of prime directives, and it scrolls, and as fast as you like, if you freeze frame, directive 262 is avoid Orion meetings. Still, RoboCop was still tangible, and I should note, the computer game really was good of RoboCop 2, but there were still plans to do a RoboCop 3, although Peter Weller at this point, even when he was promoting RoboCop 2, said the script would have to be really good to do a third one. He confirmed he hadn't signed up for RoboCop 3 and laughed, I barely signed up for RoboCop 2. Weller wouldn't make RoboCop 3. In fact, I've covered that previously in a podcast episode. I might come back to it in more detail a little bit later down the line, but it would be a very, very different environment in which the ultimate third film would be released, because Orion, in the end, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy by the end of 1991. I mean, it had swept the Oscars that year with Silence of the Lambs. The year before, it had swept the Oscars with Dances with Wolves, and it filed for bankruptcy just weeks before The Addams Family became the huge hit that it would have really needed to keep going. RoboCop 2 turned a profit, and it certainly made its money on video as well, but a juggernaut it was not. And over time, the stories of the film really have been about the version of the movie that we didn't get, because we've now seen Frank Miller's original script be serialized in comic book form. That came out a couple of years ago, so you can see exactly which direction he wanted to take this. But interestingly, the idea from Newmar Newmar and Miner that started the whole thing off, that surfaced, I gather, in the RoboCop TV series of the 1990s. But it's now getting a fresh run too in another cinema movie called RoboCop Returns, which is currently stuck in development within Hollywood. Now, RoboCop Returns was going to be directed by Neil Blomkamp of District 9 and Chappie and Elysium fame. Now it's Abe Forsyth who's said to be directing it, but the film appears to have stuck into some kind of limbo. But it would, in theory, pick up some of the ideas that Miner and Newmar originally had for the RoboCop sequel. As it turned out, the RoboCop 2 that we got is a frustrating beast, really. I think it's Christopher Griffiths who's making a trilogy of RoboCop documentaries. And I think it's the stories of 2 and 3, really, are the ones I are particularly fascinated by, because I think a lot of the stories of RoboCop 1 are pretty well known. RoboCop 3 would follow a couple of years later, but it would be heavily delayed as a result of Orion and the rights problems and Orion going out of business and new owners. And so RoboCop 2 was its last huge shot at a big blockbuster movie. It didn't really hit. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. Just a couple of notices then. First of all, I am 100% an independent. I am one person who sits in a room. I don't have a big company or anything like that behind me, really. The only reason this podcast has got as far as it's got is thanks to the support of people like you. If you do like Film Stories, please can you ideally subscribe at your podcast repository of choice. Also, ideally leave a hugely positive review. All that kind of stuff works with the algorithms and stuff, and apparently makes Film Stories bubble up on lists, and that helps enormously just getting the word out of it. I also make Film Stories magazine and Film Stories Junior magazines. I'll have news on the new issues of both of those imminently. You can find back copies of all of them at store.filmstories.co.uk, and I've got a Blu-ray coming out, a very first Blu-ray release in conjunction with Plumeria Pictures. We've worked on new extras for this. It's of Sneakers, which I did a podcast of a few episodes back, and that comes out in the UK on June the 28th, 2021. On earlier, the week before, June the 23rd, 2021, I'm live in Birmingham, waffling on in person at the Midlands Arts Centre. You can find out more about that at filmstories.co.uk. But now I'm going to crack on with the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. Let's go to 1999 this time. This is a small indie movie that seemed to have a bit of a tale to it. Play your clip, pick up the story the other side of this.
Oh my God, my cat costume's gone. Bring it on.
From New Line Cinema.
What kind of a moron paints step ladders right before a pageant?
Kirstie Alley, Ellen Barkin, Kirsten Dunst, Denise Richards.
Look at that winner. I think she's had a boob job.
Oh, come on. She's too young for a boob job.
They do that at birth now. What are you talking about?
Our pageant is not a peep show.
Oh, God, you rule, Leslie!
Drop Dead Gorgeous.
Suck it in, or so help me, I shoved my foot so far.
Come on, shake your body, baby, do that conga.
There you go. That was the end of the trailer for 1999's Drop Dead Gorgeous, directed by Michael Patrick Jan, written by Lona Williams, and starring Denise Richards, Kirsten Dunst, Ellen Barkin, Kirstie Alley, Amy Adams in there as well, and the brilliant Alison Janney in the ensemble. And the story of this one goes back to Lona Williams, its writer, its sole credited writer, who, well, in her youth, had been a contestant in beauty contests in the US, local beauty contests. So she won Minnesota's Junior Miss. She had a background in knowing how local pageants worked, and she got to the national finals as well. And so she decided to channel these experiences into writing a screenplay. Now, Drop Dead Gorgeous was her first produced screenplay. She wrote it in her early 30s, and she'd actually finished second in the national beauty pageant that she'd entered into. And she talked about in interviews about how she saw the pageant as a way to get out of the Rosemont area where she'd grown up, and how she won a scholarship. It got her to the University of Minnesota, and she was able to build a career off the back of that. Now, BuzzFeed did a really excellent look back at the film on its 15th anniversary, so this was quite a way back. But she talked in there about how how Williams brought together 1,000 little bits of her life, is how she describes it in the film. And she pitched it from the start as a darker, satirical story, but it was a script that soon got some attention as well. That it wasn't going to be the most expensive film to make, but it came in, it was picked up by New Line Cinema, and New Line fairly quickly then offset the cost of the movie that was going to cost about $10-15 million to make. Not huge at a point where New Line had the Austin Powers sequel out the same year and was just about to embark on a trilogy of Lord of the Rings films. Wonder what happened to them. But it offset the cost of Drop Dead Gorgeous by selling international rights to other companies in certain territories. Now, the original script was going by the name of Dairy Queens, and in came Gavin Pallone to produce the film. Now, Pallone and Lona Williams didn't get on massively well from what I can tell. For instance, he vetoed a cameo she'd written for herself in the film, although she did appear in another role. But a first-time director was then approached about helming the film, Michael Patrick Jann. Now, he was in his mid-20s, and again, this wouldn't really be a happy collaboration between writer and director. But for the minute, the film was coming together. And Jann would describe to BuzzFeed about how impressed he was by how offbeat the movie was. As someone who'd done acting himself as well, he could see that this had something to it. He described it as, you're really invested in this particular story and then it's gone and you're like, oh, this isn't the story of the good girl versus the bad girl. This is a more esoteric story of how success is sort of mercenary and empty and meaningless. Now, it's worth contextualising. This was a point where teen movies were on the verge of really booming in Hollywood. I mean, Election and Clueless and films of that ilk were around this era. Clueless really had shown that you could make money off a film like this, and that interests Hollywood studios. That's just the kind of thing they apparently like, money. And so it was pressing ahead. Now, Jann would do some work rewriting the script, which led to the start of some disagreements with Williams. And Williams had viewed the film, and she admits a naivety of this, because it was a mockumentary, she thought it'd be a bunch of unknowns who would take the roles in the movie, which isn't really how it panned out. Because auditions for the young ensemble took place, and I mean, quite a few known names at the time put themselves forward. Sarah Michelle Gellar, who was sprung to fame off the Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV series, she reportedly auditioned for the movie. Sabrina the Teenage Witch star Melissa Joan Hart, she definitely auditioned for this one, but in the end she'd go off and make a rom-com called Drive Me Crazy instead. Now, Kirsten Dunst, she'd broken through as a child actor in films like Jumanji and Interview with the Vampire, but what convinced Jann that she was right for one of the lead roles in the movie was seeing her on a TV show, Celebrity Teen Jeopardy. And Jann told BuzzFeed she was so sweet and so normal and so guileless, and that's the girl who can grab the microphone out of a dead reporter's hand and joyfully keep reporting with no guile. There's no evil in her. There's no premeditation. And that was kind of what he wanted for that character. He described her as, she was at ease with being ill at ease, which was charming to me. Denise Richards, by this stage, well, she was cast in a character who's 17 years old, and she was edging towards her late 20s, but she'd hit gold with the film Wild Things, and in fact she would sign up to a James Bond film as well that would arrive around the same time. The World Is Not Enough, remember that one? And so she was added to the ensemble, and amongst those who auditioned was a young Amy Adams as well, who made her film debut in the movie Drop Dead Gorgeous. And Adams would reflect a cinema blend, although notably she didn't get involved at all in the BuzzFeed piece looking back at the movie, but she reflected a cinema blend. She said, that was my first movie I ever made. Everything about that movie was just so surreal to me. It was the first time I realised I think I could go to Hollywood and at least get some commercials or something. The late Brittany Murphy, she signed on as well a few years after Clueless. And for the rest of the younger roles, local actors were from the Minnesota area. They filled out some of those parts. And I mean, this was a film in and around beauty pageants, so it needed a fair few extras. And it was local actors who took on those roles. But for the adult roles, they were looking for some more prominent names. So top of the list for New Line Cinema was Sigourney Weaver. Would she take on the role of Gladys in the film? And would Goldie Hawn take on the role of Annette? Now, if you've not seen the film, it doesn't matter if you don't know who Gladys or Annette are. But let's just say these are prominent roles in the movie, although they are supporting roles, really. And in the end, Sigourney Weaver didn't do the film. Goldie Hawn didn't do the film. And it was Kirstie Alley and Ellen Barkin who would land the roles, and once, not uncommon, when they were cast, those roles were just slightly rewritten to accommodate the performers who were going to take them on. Now, Alison Janney was still, I think, he's one of the absolute standouts of this movie. I mean, Alison Janney is great in pretty much everything she's in. But she talked about getting her role in the film in an interview with the Huffington Post. And she says she described how she'd just done a Broadway production of Arthur Miller's A View from the Bridge, and Brittany Murphy was in that alongside her. The person who cast Drop Dead Gorgeous was a man called John Papsidera. And from what Janney said, it was Brittany Murphy had a word with him and said that he really needed to get Alison Janney in the movie. And she said, that's the way I remember it anyway. But Janney got hold of the script and she said, I read the script and of course wanted to be part of it because I love humour like this. I love slightly off humour, sort of inappropriate humour. It's just more fun. And so she was drawn to the character of Loretta and she just said, quote, I thought I could definitely play this trailer trash woman. And so she she was cast in the film. She threw herself into preparation. She would go to the Mall of America and just listen to people talking. And she just said, no, I'd go out there, I'd go into the stores and I'd follow people to eavesdrop on them and listen to the accents. And she said, I had a recorder and I'd surreptitiously try to record people. Probably not the best thing to admit, really. And she said, we had a great dialect coach on the movie, a man called Michael Buster. And she said, the more time I spent at the mall, the more I soaked in, especially with my brothers and with my brother and his friends. And she found the character and the look of the character as well that she would ultimately put on the screen. Now, it's worth noting, as the film headed towards production, it did have to go through a further change because, well, they couldn't call it Dairy Queens because Dairy Queen was a brand name in the US and they got wind that this mockumentary film, and a very dark mockumentary film that's spiking the idea of beauty pageants, was being made using its trademark name, and out came the lawsuit and thus a new name was sought for the movie. It became Drop Dead Gorgeous and filming could finally begin in July of 1998 in the movie. Now, filming took place in and around the Minnesota area. And again, going back to the disagreements between writer and director on this one, Williams and Jan clashed on the set of the film. So let's go back to that BuzzFeed piece. And Williams said, I just found, talking about Jan, to be a bit of an asshole. She said, I remember going out in the rain crying, going to my rental car, like having a full body cry because I felt like, oh my God, this could get away and not turn out the way I see it. And she said there are a couple of things like that. And then I pulled myself together. But I mean, the killer sentence where she says, I really didn't favour him. Interestingly, in the same piece, Jan, effectively corroborated it to some degree, where he said, I think I probably could have been nicer. As a 26-year-old, I was probably a little bit more like, no, we're clucking doing it this way. Did you spot the little centering there? So what are you talking about? I was maybe a tiny bit insensitive at that time in my life. Still, going back to the overall tone of that BuzzFeed piece, it does paint a picture, though, of, on the whole, it being a good shoot and a happy shoot. That, in particular, a lot of the actors seem to have a good time on this particular movie. That Jan's approach to doing this, and I think it's not uncommon when making mockumentaries, is to film what's in the to film what was in the screenplay, to do one or two different versions of that, and then to give the actors a bit of space to improvise and try something themselves. And that seemed to go down particularly well. Now, the 6-week shoot in all for the movie. Well, not all of the actors were on the shoot for all of that time, particularly the adult actors that Janney was fitting in other commitments. I think we're in West Wing time at this point. And Kirstie Alley and Ellen Barkin, they would each do 2 weeks apiece on the shoot. But heck, by the sounds of it, Kirstie Alley made an impression. Now, again, I'm quoting this directly, so if there are any lawyers listening, just know that at heart I'm a complete coward, and thus the direct quote from the article reads, according to Williams, Alley, who declined to comment for this story, refused to wear many of the costumes chosen for her and didn't show up to fittings. Instead, she had her clothes sent to the Scientology Celebrity Centre in Hollywood and would try them on there. She also turned down working with the on-set dialect coach. And on her first day on set, she gets up there and she announces that she's just quit smoking, she's on a diet and she's got her period. She also filmed her scenes, her 2 weeks, the material in the can, but there had to be a little bit of nimbleness in how they shot it, because the film, I don't think I'm going to spoil it heavy here, revolves ultimately around a huge beauty pageant, and a lot of the reaction stuff to the pageant had to be filmed separately from the pageant itself. I mean, it's by the way that the cast describe it, it's like one of those moments where they're working on a big CG movie like Jurassic Park or something, having to react to a ping pong ball. They're having to react to a pageant that wasn't happening in the room at the time that they were reacting to it. Nonetheless, filming wrapped up on the movie on September the 11th, 1998, and it was into post-production with a view of the film coming out in the summer of 1999. Now, Jan wanted to make sure that the film came in somewhere around an hour and a half. He wanted this to be really lean. In fact, the final running time is 98 minutes. And so he trimmed back sequences and subplots to make that possible. And whilst New Line had been very hands-off really throughout the making of the film, partly I would suggest because it was shot in Minnesota, some way away from Hollywood, New Line was a bit more on it when it came to the post-production period, in particular the tone of the movie. Now, if you've not seen the film, again, there are a lot of teen movies came around in and around this time. This is the dark one. Without question, this is much darker than a lot of the films that are around. I mean, this was the same summer that American Pie went absolutely stratospheric at the box office on a small budget. Drop Dead Gorgeous's tone always made that very, very, very unlikely. And in fact, they held test screenings of this one, and audience concerns were duly highlighted to the point of the ending of the movie being redone. I mean, it's a dark ending that you get in the film anyway, but it was a very dark ending originally that involved a shooting being done by an unlikely character, but that ending didn't go down well at all when it was tested, and the change was duly made. New Line's big challenge then lay ahead, because how do you sell a film like this? And it's a question that was never really convincingly answered, because the answer really is not easily at all. And it was said that it was only when the tracking for the film came in advance of release that New Line panicked a little bit. Now, the tracking is basically finding out the audience awareness of a film. If an audience isn't aware of a movie 2 months before or a month before, it's not going to have much of an impact at the box office. And the research that New Line had done suggested Drop Dead Gorgeous was not going to have really that much of a splash whatsoever. And as a result, it decided that it wanted notable changes to the film very late in the day. It wanted it to get closer to the look and the feel of Clueless. Could they sell it like Clueless? Could the film be a bit close to Clueless? Well, no. It couldn't. The raw materials for that really weren't there. And in fact, Jan resisted and pushed back against that. But New Line, nonetheless, it wanted the film toned down. Now, there was an odd bit of studio interference in the midst of it all that Jan, primarily because of the material in the can, was able to win the battles over the tone. But because of the way they'd sold the rights to various different companies around the world, there was one request that a Japanese singer by the name of Saiko Matsuda would make a brief appearance in the film to satisfy that particular territory and the distributor in that particular territory. So that was done. But then, as the film headed towards that summer 1999 release, they couldn't shake the paradox that in the end it had the look and a cast of a mainstream film in the marketing, but the actual film that audiences turned up to see was a lot darker. And New Line really didn't have an awful lot of confidence in it. It hardly gave this much in the way of marketing support, but also it reconciled it didn't really need to, because it had sold those foreign rights and because it had sold rights around the world for enough money to basically recoup its investment on the film. New Line figured that as long as it doesn't over-promote the film and spend ridiculous amounts on marketing, it's just going to make a small profit on this. That was the worst-case scenario it was looking at. As such, it didn't spend an awful lot of money on the marketing of the film. The film went out fairly quietly for a July 1999 release, and it would be fair to say the critics absolutely blasted this one to bits. It did not go down well at all, because there's a real mismatch between the film that was being sold and the film that people were getting. And so lots of the reviews were particularly unkind, and some of the people involved in the movie have talked about just how painful the reviews really had got. when it landed in cinemas, well, it opened in 11th place at the box office with a 3.9 million opening weekend on July the 23rd to the 25th. The films that were dominating the box office at that point, well, The Haunting opened at number 1 with 33 million, and The Haunting is not a good film, but it had a blanket marketing spend. Also not a good film with a blanket marketing spend was the film that opened in second place, Disney's take on Inspector Gadget with Rupert Everett. American Pie was still in third place, another 10 million. Eyes Wide Shut was fourth. Big Daddy was fifth. Lake Placid was sixth. Wiki Wiki Wild 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 West was at 7. Tarzan at 8. The Wood was at 9. Star Wars The Phantom Menace after 10 weeks was at 10. And there was Drop Dead Gorgeous, sat in 11th place. And its box office fortunes did not improve from that point onwards, that the week after it had dropped down to 15th place, while films like The Runaway Bride and Deep Blue Sea opened. And then, well, you go to the week after that, it's down to 22nd after 3 weeks on release, as The Sixth Sense was cleaning up at the box office. The film would go on to take $10.5 million and wouldn't cover its production budget on its cinema run. And ordinarily, that would have been that. But here's a film whose reputation has grown fairly recently, I'd suggest, in the last 10 years. I don't think there was an instant moment where this one turned into a cult favourite, but I think it's got to that point now. And so Janney, I mean, let's go to that Alison Janney interview she did with the Huffington Post. I mean, she talked a little bit really about just how the studio was not really going to town on this. She said, I wasn't really included in the paid ads or any of the promotion. They didn't ask me to go to the premiere, so I didn't get to go to it. I wasn't on the poster. And so they said usually they don't ask you to the premiere if you're not included on the poster, because then they have to pay for you to get there, and that involves money, so they don't want to pay for everyone in the film to come. But Janney would talk about how this is, of the films that she's made, the one that she tends to be approached about, most prominently, really. The West Wing clearly gets a lot of fan attention, but Drop Dead Gorgeous has really stuck through, and so she gets people turning up and just talking to her about the film. And for a while, I wonder if its reputation was helped by the fact that it was really hard to track down. That whilst a lot of films quickly found their way onto streaming services and such like in the 2010s, Drop Dead Gorgeous took a long time to get there. And in fact, for a while, the DVD was out of print. It wasn't on digital services. It turned up on Hulu in the US in 2019, and then it landed with something of a splash. That it became clear that this was a film with far more fans than people really gave it credit for. Warner Archive in the US has subsequently given it a Blu-ray release as well, which is what I bought to rewatch the film on. And so the film itself has had something of a happy ending to it. Not really so for the two main creators behind it, that this would be the only film that he would direct. He would go back to doing commercial work primarily in the aftermath of it. And then, well, for writer Lona Williams, her next film was Sugar and Spice. And that was a film, again, heavily toned down by its studio to the point where she would take her name off it. And she's had a few credits since, but again, I think she's got a particular edge to her comedy that doesn't always seem particularly compatible with Hollywood studios. There was one person who did rather well, though. Someone called Kirsten Dunst. Remember her? She would go straight on to make another teen movie. That movie would be called Bring It On. I might come to that one in a future podcast. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for listening. If you want more of my waffling, crikey, if you could stand it, I'm on Twitter at Simon Brew. The entire Film Stories project is on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories. And then if you want to support this podcast, it's at patreon.com/Simon Brew. Thank you to all the Patreon backers who help me keep putting this podcast together. If you want a daily dose every weekday, a dose of movie news, nerdisms, film stories and such like, our website is www.filmstories.co.uk. And as I mentioned at the halfway point, you can buy all of our back issues of our magazines and our upcoming Blu-ray at store.filmstories.co.uk. As always, though, the main thing is that you all stay safe and well. I thank you, as always, for your support, and I thank you for your time. I'll be back with you again soon with another bunch of film stories. You all take care. Bye-bye.